Welcome to History at High Noon. A few announcements to start with. We are putting up a new exhibit. It's called World War II on the Home Front. And we're taking memories of people, whether you were there when it happened or if your parents told you. And so if you'll drop by the museum, and we have a form that you can fill out. You don't have to sign it. We've got quite a few. Some of them I'm not sure I can put on the exhibit, but we're going to try. But that's what we're working with. And also, dues are coming up. So if you haven't paid your dues, they're due June 1st for those on that schedule. And just a reminder of that. And today, we have someone to speak relative to World War II. We have Dr. McDonald. He was a Methodist minister.
Well, still am, actually.
Still am, yes. But no church right now.
Right.
Okay. And a college professor. So that's how I knew him when he first taught a college class at the high school. Of course, his wife worked there also. But he's going to speak today. We're so glad to have you because I've heard this is going to be great information. So welcome, Dr. McDonald.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Carol. I really do appreciate that introduction. I wanted to ask you all a question to begin with. How many of you, prior to today, have ever heard of the Armed Services editions that were passed out to the troops during World War II? Okay, we do have a few people. Now, Jim's heard this presentation before, so I don't know if you've heard about it prior to that or not. And how many of you have actually seen or held one of these Armed Services editions? Anybody? All right. Well, I happen to collect them. I have a small collection, and I'm going to talk about that a little bit too, and you'll get an opportunity to see what they're really like. So today's presentation is about World War II history. It's about an aspect of World War II history, something that I'm extremely interested in. But it's also about, since we're dealing with books, it's about censorship, it's about control of the media, it's about the history of paperback books, it's about the importance of books, and it's about the importance of understanding and appreciating history. The first thing I want to turn to is the timeline that was passed out to every one of you. Now, we're not going to go through this whole thing line by line. It would take up too much time. And some of it is simply a timeline of really significant things that happened that brought us into World War II. And you'll be able to read about those on your own. But the U.S. Army had always been interested in providing books for their soldiers, even prior to the war. There were libraries on Army posts, for instance. There was no Air Force at that time. The Army Air Corps, which became the Army Air Force, and then after the war became a separate branch, the U.S. Air Force. Likewise, those people, they had libraries. The soldiers were very interested in being able to read and to further their education, or just do this for pleasure or to avoid boredom. But these libraries began to fall into disrepair because of funding cuts. So that became a problem, and it continued to be a problem even throughout the war on those particular posts that were stateside. Now, at the same time, in 1933, you know as well as I do that the Nazis were in the business of burning books. So there's a paragraph here about that, about the book burning that took place on May 10th. It was broadcast live over radio. It was filmed to be shown in movie theaters. Goebbels said, "The old goes up in flames, the new shall be fashioned from the flame of our hearts." And they had 93 additional book burnings after that. By 1938, the Nazis had banned 18 categories of books, 4,175 titles, and the complete works of 565 authors. Now, you talk about censorship. They were good at it. The Nazis were good at it. In 1935, Alan Lane, who was a British publisher, introduced Penguin paperback books. Now, I know you're all familiar with Penguin paperback books. That was the first mass-market production of paperback books. They opened an office in the United States in 1939, 4 years later. In 1938, Pocket Books Company in the United States published a small test run, less than 3,000 copies, of Pearl S. Buck's great book, The Good Earth, that was sold only in New York City's Macy's department store, just to see what the market for that kind of thing might have been. And then later, it developed when they began to produce paperbacks. The very first paperback book, this is a fact that most people don't know, the very first paperback book in the United States was James Hilton's Lost Horizon. And that's a great book if you've never read it. That's the book that features Shangri-La, that fictional place. When the Doolittle raid took place in April of 1942, from the aircraft carrier Hornet, bombed mainland Japan. The Japanese couldn't figure out how this could have happened, where these planes come from, and Roosevelt simply said they came from Shangri-La. And then he later named his camp for recreation and for reflection and that sort of thing. He named it Camp Shangri-La, and it was later named Camp David. So there's another interesting tidbit. In September, Germany declared war on Poland, and Britain and France turned around and declared war on Germany. In 1940, Hitler signed an armistice with the French government, what part of it he was interested in occupying especially. In 1940, in September, the Congress, U.S. Congress, passed the Selective Training and Service Act. That was the first wartime draft. These are just some dates to put things in perspective for you. In 1941, Germany invaded the Soviet Union after they had signed a non-aggression pact with the Soviet Union only 2 years earlier. And then December 7th, 1941, Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor. They raided Pearl Harbor. The United States declared war on Japan, and then Germany declared war on the United States, and later that day the United States declared war on Germany. Now all of a sudden we got a world war going on. So now we come to 1942 and the focus of what we're here to talk about today. The Council on Books in Wartime was a group of publishers, librarians, and booksellers that were formed to use books to contribute to the war effort. They saw books as weapons in the war of ideas, and part of this was in response to the Nazi book burning and to that level of censorship. That same year, the newly appointed chief of the U.S. Army's Library Section, First Lieutenant Ray Troutman, who possessed a professional library degree from Columbia University, Jim's alma mater. I told him I knew that's why he came, was because of this Troutman fellow from Columbia University. He developed a plan to produce low-cost books for overseas military distribution, because our soldiers now were going all over the world. They were going to fight in the European theater. They were going to fight in the Pacific theater. It truly was a global war. And we felt, this council did anyway, and backed by the American people, that these soldiers needed to have these books. And they needed books that would be small enough and light enough to carry around. A book you could put in your pocket, you could stick in your knapsack, something that didn't weigh a lot. And so that was part of what they were looking for here. So he developed a plan to produce the low-cost books for distribution. He took the plan to the Council on Books in Wartime, and the idea behind the Armed Services editions was born. Between 1943 and 1947, editions for the Armed Services Incorporated, nonprofit organization, published nearly 123 million copies of 1,322 books for distribution to U.S. Armed Forces around the world. In spite of that, the number of books that were published and how widely they were disseminated, there's only one complete set of those books in existence, and it's at the Library of Congress. They are the only place that has every one of these books. And of course, you can imagine that when you're carrying them around in combat, a lot of these books ended up getting destroyed, lost, whatever the case may be. Some of them are really hard to find. Some of them are almost impossible to find. So that's why that's the only complete set. that, interestingly enough, here's a tidbit. Now, I'm an Auburn University graduate, War Eagle. And so I almost hate to say this because I didn't think they read books there, but the University of Alabama has all but 16 of these books. They have probably the second biggest collection that there is at the University of Alabama. Interestingly enough, this thing, after 1947, which was 2 years after the war, they still produced them for those 2 years, though, because there were occupation forces to whom they could send these books. So it was still a popular thing. But after 1947, they stopped producing them and distributing them. But they took it up again in 2002, the Legacy Project. They led a brief revival of these books, and 7 of the titles were distributed to U.S. soldiers and sailors. So what are these books? Well, let's talk about that now. First of all, I talked to you about how they had to be light, they had to be small, they had to be something that these soldiers could carry around very easily, so that was all taken into consideration. Several presses got together with this Council on Wartime to come up with an idea for how they could do this thing. So here's the idea they came up with. They printed the books in 2 different sizes. It started off, they were printed according to the Reader's Digest format. At the time, the Reader's Digest was the size of this piece of paper right here. If you take the whole piece of paper, that's what the Reader's Digest was. So they decided to make the first and most of the books the size of half of this. What they would do is they would print 2 books at the same time, and then they would cut them in half. Okay? There were several presses involved. The Reader's Digest was the one who did this size of book. When they started making a larger book, which was this size, where the black is right here, this part right here, that was the other size. There's only 2 sizes. They used pulp magazine presses to do these. The reason they were called pulp magazines, of course, is because of the quality of the paper. It was made out of cheap pulp wood, and it was easy to use. It was inexpensive. So that's the presses that did these. So these are pulp magazine presses did the larger ones, and the Reader's Digest presses did these. They were able to make these books to begin with for a total cost of 7 cents per book.
Really?
Yeah. Later on, because of the volume they were doing them in, they got it down to 6 cents. 6 cents. Now, how did they bind the books? Well, first of all, it had to have a paper cover. So a separate press printed all the covers for all the books, both sizes. All right? Then, how do they put these books together? They put them together with staples. The reason they put them together with staples is that glue would not hold up, especially in certain kinds of weather, like in the Pacific, for instance. Bugs like glue, so they couldn't use glue. They couldn't afford to bind them in a hardcover fashion, so they used staples to put these books together, right? So there's the 2 sizes. Now, you think about that, 123 million copies of 1,323 books. Now, of that 1,323 books, 99 are reprints, exact reprints. So when you talk about separate titles, there would be, 1,233 or something like that, separate. All right. The Roth Company, by the way, the Common Day Roth Company, they're the ones who printed all the covers. Not that you would need that information. So I want to show you what these books look like. First of all, and I'll pass some around, and you're not going to even have heard of some of this stuff. Here is the little book. This is Mrs. Egg and Other Barbarians, short stories by Thomas Beer. Okay? Here's the larger book. This is excerpts from Yank magazine, which is an interesting thing itself because that magazine was a magazine for the soldiers. This is a Yank magazine. This is from August 13th, 1944, not too long after D-Day. That's what Yank magazine looked like, and this is excerpts, selections from Yank magazine that they put in here. And you can also see from this, some of the books were very thin, like this one, and some of them were pretty darn thick. The longest book is over 500 pages long. And another thing about these books is, except for special editions, these are the original entire book. They're not abridged. They did not do abridgments. But some of them, when I mentioned the special selections type books, like short stories, for instance. Suppose you're a person who collects the works of William Faulkner. Well, there's an Armed Services edition of William Faulkner short stories that's a selection made strictly by the Council on Wartime, and if you want to have a complete collection of the works of William Faulkner, you're going to have to get that book, because it's the only one that's like that, the Armed Services edition. I've got one of Catherine Mansfield Porter here, which was one of the most popular of the books. Same thing, it's selections. It's selections from her works. This one right here. And so if you wanted to collect all her works, you'd have to get this book, because this is the only one that's got that particular selection in it.
Dr. McDonald, I don't see the staple in that book you're holding up. Where are the staples?
The staples are underneath the cover. The cover itself is glued on, but the book is stapled.
I got you.
Yeah. So here's one of the small ones. Here's one of the big ones. I'll pass out some more. And by the way, there are all kinds of subjects. Here's a book of soldier art. This is artwork that was done by actual soldiers. You see? I'll pass this one around. And they put it into a book. They thought other soldiers would be interested in it. Now, some of these books were controversial. We were talking about censorship. They actually censored some of these. When I say they, it depends on who it is. The Council on Books in Wartime sometimes would not print some books, and they were under instructions not to print books that were so politically biased that it would be controversial. In other words, you know, Roosevelt served 4 terms as president. He didn't finish that last term because he died in Warm Springs, as you know. But there was always the thought that, you know, you can't promote Roosevelt unduly, because that would not be fair to any other candidate, because soldiers, that's a lot of voters, right? These 2 books came under scrutiny. The Republic by Charles Beard. This is basically a history and political science book about the United States. This book, Yankee from Olympus, is about Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes. All right? For some reason, there were a group of people who thought that there was too much politics in these 2 books, so a committee had to get together, go through these books painstakingly, and that's when they discovered, especially this one, the Charles Beard, it's not political, it's just about our government, basically. And the same thing with this one. And so that's why we now have them. But originally, they refused to publish these books. And then, of course, you get into the ones that are, let's see, the ones that are risque.
Oh, yeah.
There was a great demand among the soldiers, by the way, for those kinds of books. This book right here, Strange Fruit, by Lillian Smith. I've got this one inside this bag, and it's not coming out of the bag. It's in great condition. This book was really hard for me to get, and it did cost me some money, but you couldn't hardly find this book. It was so popular. It was banned in Boston, even for the public libraries, for instance, to have the original hardcover copy. No, it was banned in Boston. The U.S. Post Office refused to mail it. Now, part of the reason is because it's about a very touchy subject, two touchy subjects, one of which is, I didn't mean any pun, but anyway, racial relations. Okay, it's about a couple, an interracial couple, and pregnancy is involved, and there's a lot of sad things that happen. There's a murder that takes place, but at the same time it has some pretty explicit sexual content, and so the soldiers really wanted to get a hold of this book. The other book that was like that was Forever Amber. That one was also banned in certain parts of the United States, but the council managed to get it through because this is what the soldiers wanted. So here's the Armed Services edition of the book. And every one of these, as you can see on the books that are going around, they have a summary on the back of what the book is about, and then there's a photograph on the front of what the hardcover original book looked like with its dust jacket and all. And it actually states on them, this is the complete book, not a digest. You see? So the soldier knows he's getting the original book just in this format. And again, you can see, you can just slip this thing in your pocket. It hardly weighs anything. Now, it is true, they don't last real well, especially in wet weather, but they would pass these around. In that one handout that I gave you, the timeline handout, attached to that are some photographs from Manning's book. And you can see that there's one scene where there's a tent there. You see that one, Jim? Mm-hmm. Where the soldiers are sitting in those folding chairs and reading books. That's a makeshift library out in the field, in the middle of combat. You know, or in a more rear area. It wouldn't have been in the middle of combat. But, and then there are some titles. Here's another one that was really hard for me to get. Upfront by Bill Malden. Now, the original book, you know who Bill Malden was? Bill Malden was a GI himself. He worked for Stars and Stripes. He was a cartoonist. He was an artist. And he created the characters Willie and Joe for his book. Well, originally all these cartoons were in Stars and Stripes, but then he put together a book called Upfront that had the story of the GI in the European theater. And the book, which I happen to have I've got, I think, 3 different first editions of the original book. This is the one that's the most beat up, so that's the one I carry around. This book, you see, was published by Henry Holt and Company in 1945. So right there at the end of the war. And of course, as you know, they keep publishing these things till 1947. So that's why we have this one up front. But it's hard to get, very hard to get. You all know who Ernie Pyle was, right? See, here's one of Ernie Pyle's books, Brave Men, in an Armed Services edition. There's all kinds of things. One time, my mail carrier is really into gardening and planting things, and he loves tractors and all this kind of stuff. And I was searching through these books on eBay one day, and I came across one that was on agriculture. So I ordered it because it was real cheap. It was like $5, and I gave it to him. He'd never seen one of those things before, and I explained to him what it was, and he was just tickled pink. You know, they had them on all subjects, all kinds of subjects. Now, I mentioned to you the reprints. This is interesting. See, here's what they did. They put them out in series. They started with A, then A, B, C, D, E, F, G, all the way like that, and got through the whole alphabet, started over again with A, got through T, T. So there's 46 different series. Well, here's the exact same book, The Middle-Aged Man on the Flying Trapeze by James Thurber, where it is I-253. Now, after, I think it was after that series, they quit putting the letter in front of it and just put a number. So here's the same book, number 705 and number I-253. So I-253 would have come first. And then number 753 is from one of those later series, because some were pretty popular, that enough to be reprinted. So I think this is kind of nice to have something like this. Whoops, there goes one of my books. Excuse me. I have to retrieve that. Oh, here's another one. Y'all heard of, those of us who are older, we know who Sad Sack is, right? The Sad Sack, the Army cartoon. See, that started during World War II. And so here's a book of cartoons from Sad Sack. And then this just goes to show you how quickly they publish some things, because this book by Captain Harry Butcher, My 3 Years with Eisenhower. This is about World War II. But it came out after the war was over. But it was still being printed in these editions. So, okay, so now, as I said, if you would be interested in getting some of these books, it's real easy to do. Just get on eBay and put Armed Services Editions, search in there, and bam, they got hundreds of them. But they're stuff you never heard of. Most of it. But some of them are, and some of them are as cheap as they can be. Some of them are like $5 for one of those books, but then they go way up, you know. I was looking the other day on eBay, and there was one of the ones I've got that's gone up to $150 now, and I think I probably got it for about $10. So you could look at it as an investment. Now, the queen of all these books, which was probably, or at least possibly, the most popular book in the whole series, A Tree Grows in Brooklyn by Betty Smith. D117. I'm not forgetting that number. D series number 117. You cannot find that book. If any of you ever come across that book and you can't afford to buy it, which you won't be able to, call me and let me know and I'll think about it. I won't think about buying it for you, but I'll think about buying it for myself. You can't find that book. I mean, you can find the actual original book. You can find first editions of it, and they're not cheap. But this Armed Services edition of that book, forget it. D117. But still, I search about once a month, because you never know when somebody who doesn't know what they have is putting that thing up for sale for $10.99. You know, so that's how I got Strange Fruit. Somebody who obviously didn't know what they had when they put that up for sale. So let's talk about the impact of these books for just a minute, and then I'll conclude. And by the way, more books were given to the armed services during World War II, these armed service editions, than the Nazis burned. So we won in the battle of the books, as well as the actual battle. But these books were really important for a variety of reasons. First of all, they definitely boosted morale. Soldiers would say that they were like getting a letter from home. That Betty Smith book, A Tree Grows in Brooklyn, especially if you're from New York City, or any big city really, but especially if you were from Brooklyn in New York City, it's like getting a letter from home. They loved that book. She got so many letters of gratitude from soldiers, and some of that's in the photographs that I put in there for you. So morale, it was a real morale booster. These books also reminded service personnel of what it is they were fighting for, because they got a taste of home from being able to read these books. The books provided intellectual stimulation. They provided respite from combat or from boredom. You know, you're not always on the front line. When you're relieved and you get to move back and you get to do a little R&R, see, that's when something like these books would really come in handy, and they'd put up these impromptu libraries and people would be swapping these books around like crazy. But even during lulls in combat, a soldier would pull out his book and start reading. So they were really important in that way. And they enhanced comradeship because the soldiers talked about the books to each other. They swapped the books with each other. They encouraged many of the soldiers to further their education after the war. And there are many books, by the way, in these editions that are like school books. There are books on science, there are books on history, there are books on mathematics, there's books on all kinds, every subject you can think of just about. If you look through that list of all those books, and that's a lot of titles, isn't it? You'll see the variety and the intellectual stimulation that could be gained from these things. So these are the Armed Services editions, and it's been my pleasure to share this with you because I think it's a really important part of our history. So thank you very much. Has anybody got any questions?
I do.
Yeah.
You told us how they banned or recruited bad books. How did they get the titles to start? What was the process for them to choose?
Okay, that's a good question. And the answer to that question is that publishing companies would go through their lists of the sales that they made on various books, and they would get titles from the books that were the most popular. But there were also people who represented education on this committee who specifically wanted titles that would help these soldiers to learn something and to become interested in certain kinds of subjects by way of furthering their education. So that was important. Yeah. And in addition to the Armed Services editions, there were also, this is just a sideline, and I have some of these, I didn't bring any with me, but publishers produce small versions of popular magazines, like Time Magazine. You know Time Magazine's about like this. Well, there was a wartime Time Magazine that was sent to soldiers, sent overseas, that was about this big. Time Magazine. And they weren't the only ones that did that. There were other ones that did that kind of thing too. So, not only that, but it helped to conserve paper because there was a, you know how everything was being rationed? Well, that included paper.
How did you come into your first book?
The way that I came into my first book was I read about it in that book I read all kinds of books about World War II. This book by John Cole, Books in Action, the Armed Services editions, that was published in 1984. That got my interest going, but when Molly Guptill Manning came out with When Books Went to War in 2014, which is only 8 years ago, this book right here, this really did it. The photographs that are in your handout came out of this book, and I recommend this book highly. It covers the entire history. Yeah. Any other questions? That was a good one.
You said it encouraged education. I remember over here with the library or that area of school, the veterans, when they came back from World War II,
Right.
these books issued to them possibly at that time also were reading.
Did what now?
Was these books issued to these soldiers that were going to school here?
No, they weren't issued. They were issued overseas.
Okay.
So they wouldn't have been used as like a textbook or something like that. Yeah, but that doesn't mean that a library wouldn't have some.
Well, it wasn't a library. It was a school here.
Yeah.
Members, I'm sure that the veterans went to school over here to further their education after coming back. But I remember when I was a kid, 8, 9, 10 years old, reading some of these books that my cousins had brought back from World War II.
And I bet you.
I hadn't thought about that. You know, I saw them and got my hands on it. Hey, this is the same thing or same type of book that they
Same type of books that they had, yeah.
That they brought back. I guess they brought back. That's the reason I was asking if they possibly given to them at school. But, why they would.
Well, they might have donated them to schools, sure. I can see that happening. Not anything official, though.
Yeah, but I don't remember. I know they brought back some souvenirs, but I don't know where that was most.
Yeah, well, that's the source of most of these books that you can still buy now, is the ones that people brought back, the soldiers brought back with them. Now, some of them would have, of course, stayed over in Europe or stayed out in the Pacific, and they either ended up getting destroyed or somebody in those places has them. But yeah, mostly they came from being brought back. Yeah. Interesting stuff, don't you think?
Very, very.
Yeah.
There were two brothers who came home from World War II, and each one of them brought a book home. And Cora Page was the librarian at the Douglas High School in 1945, and they gave her those two books.
How about that? I wonder if they're still there. I wonder if the high school's got them.
Seriously, because Cora Page left here in the 50s. Those two boys married and moved way away. The only relative I know of that still lives up there in Coffee County is Rudolph Barrington. And he was a Marine, you know.
Right.
But these were two of Rudolph's cousins. They were Moors.
How did you know about that from 1945? But how did you know that two books were donated by veterans?
Well, because I was in high school.
Okay. Good.
If you must ask.
The librarian made sure, and we had study hall. That was every day. Everybody had an hour of study hall. And the librarian made sure that everybody that came in the study hall saw those two books, and she told them where they came from.
That's great.
That is great.
And I can show you where those two boys were raised right here in Douglas, Georgia.
And by the way, speaking of books, I wanted to make a presentation to the to the museum here. And Johnny, I want you to be sure and get this so our viewers can see it. Our World War II Air Base out here on 441 South. We have in the museum out there are just, 3 copies maybe of a book that was written by a man who produced a whole series of books on forgotten airfields, the World War II airfields around the country. In 2010, his name was Lou Toll, T-H-O-L-E. In 2010, he self-published a book about the history of our air base.
Wow.
Yeah, and the title of it is Cotton, Tobacco, Peanuts, and Pilots. The story of the 63rd Flying Training Detachment. Well, as I said, you can't find this book. You can't find it on eBay or anywhere, but the museum has, I think, 3 copies. So we had the idea, and Ed is the one who followed through with getting permission from Mr. Toll, who is well up in age by now. He's not going to be with us too much longer. But he gave us permission to reproduce that book and sell it in the gift shop at the museum.
That's good.
And it's for sale for only $5. But it's more like a booklet. It's very short. But we have a copy of that book here that we had reproduced that we wanted to present to this museum. And here's a letter that's signed by me on behalf of the City of Douglas World War II Air Base Preservation and Development Committee, and by Vic Suttles, who is the president of the 63rd Preservation Society, which is the museum group. So here's the letter, and then here's some information about the base and how we are part of the Georgia World War II Heritage Trail, and then also about the Warbird Expo that's coming. You could post this in the museum, I think. So we want to give this to you, so here you are.
Thank you very much.
Oh, and let me show Jimmy, Johnny, you got it? Got it. Okay, here you go.
Thank you so much.
Thank Ed, too, because Ed was instrumental in this. Yeah.
Keep at it. Thank you, Dr. McDonald, so much. I enjoyed it immensely. And as a former librarian, I'm really excited about that. Thank y'all. We'll see you next month.